It was a Tuesday. Nobody recorded the moment. A research team in Yunnan province, southern China, was brushing dry soil off a femur 60 centimeters underground. The bone was gray-brown and hairline cracked. The person it belonged to had died around the age of 40. And they had been lying in that hillside for 7,100 years. Nobody in that excavation tent knew what was about to happen when they sent that bone to the lab. Here's what came back. When scientists analyzed the full genome of that individual, now cataloged as the Shingi skeleton, the results stopped the team. The genetic distance between this 7,000-year-old person and every modern East Asian alive today was identical to the genetic distance between modern East Asians and a 40,000-year-old Paleolithic hunter pulled from a cave near Beijing. One individual was 7,000 years old. The other was 40,000. They produced the exact same genomic gap from modern Chinese people. Think about what that means. The people buried in Chinese soil 7,000 years ago are not the ancestors of the people living in China today. Genetically speaking, they were someone else entirely. They were here first. And then, at some point in the deep past, they weren't. Dr. Qiaomei had spent 30 years pulling genomic memories out of ancient bone. She worked on Tianyuan Man, one of the oldest human remains ever found in East Asia. She had seen strange results before, but when she and her team published this finding in one of the world's leading scientific journals in May 2025, they used careful, measured language. They called the Xingyi individual a representative of a previously unknown ancient population. That phrase, previously unknown ancient population, is doing a lot of quiet work. What it doesn't say is this: the first humans to call this land home left no descendants we can find, no grandchildren, no cultural lineage that connects to a living person. They existed. That is all the record allows us to say. If you've ever wondered where you actually come from, and I mean really, in the deep biological sense, then you're going to want to stay with this, because this story goes somewhere that no one who named this civilization ever wanted you to look. Now go back further, before the Xingyi mystery, before we lose the thread, because to understand why those first people disappeared, you have to understand what was built on top of them. The Yellow River Basin, northern China, 3,000 years before the Common Era, the Longshan culture was at its peak. These were not primitive people. They built rammed earth walls 12 meters high. They made pottery so thin, walls just 1 to 2 millimeters, that modern engineers with modern equipment cannot consistently replicate it. Their settlements held tens of thousands of people. This was the Bronze Age waiting to happen. And the genetics confirm what the archaeology shows. Study after study of ancient Yellow River populations paints the same picture. The Longshan people were expanding, moving outward across the Central Plain, absorbing neighboring communities, reshaping the genomic identity of northern China across 5 centuries. They weren't just a culture, they were a demographic engine. And then, approximately 4,200 years ago, that engine stopped. The large settlements were abandoned. The pottery tradition collapsed. The population data in the archaeological record drops so sharply it looks like someone turned off a light. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, a severe drought that hit the northern hemisphere so hard it didn't just affect China, it collapsed civilizations simultaneously on 3 continents: Egypt's Old Kingdom, the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, all within the same 200-year window. The same drought, the same collapse. But here is what the climate model cannot explain. The genetic profiles of the populations that emerged after the Longshan collapse are not the same as the populations that went into it. The drought didn't just end a culture, it ended a people, and a different people appeared in their place. At a Neolithic site called Baligang in central China, ancient DNA from the settlement confirms exactly this: a sharp, clean break in the genetic record right around that 4,200-year mark. Not a gradual shift, not cultural blending over generations. A break. Someone replaced someone else. The bones know. The bones remember things that no written record survived to tell us. But here's where it gets stranger. A massive new analysis of ancient Y chromosomes from East Asia, published just this year, mapped the Longshan expansion in genomic detail. And it found a date. A migration pulse so early that the cultural evidence cannot keep up with it. The genomic clock and the archaeological record are not looking at the same event. The DNA says something happened 800 years before any artifact confirms it. One of them is wrong. The problem is that both are right. So what happened to the Xingyi people? The ones who were here before the Longshan, before the Yellow River farmers, before any of it? The obvious answer is they vanished, replaced, gone. But genomes are not clean. Replacement is never total. And sometimes you find a trace. There's a village in Yunnan province, high up where the Tibetan plateau drops toward the eastern valleys. About 400 people live there. High altitude, barley fields, cold air that smells of stone. These people have an oral tradition that says they have always been here, that their ancestors go back to the very beginning of this land. And according to a 2025 genomic study led by Qiaomei's team, their DNA agrees in part. In part, those two words carry a lot of weight. The Shingi ancestry, the genetic signature of that 7,000-year-old skeleton with no known population, does not appear in the ancient genomes of the Yellow River Basin, the Yangtze, or coastal China. It's essentially invisible across the entire lowland genomic record. But at altitude, in certain Tibetan populations, it appears, faintly, statistically, real enough to be measured, but not strong enough to constitute direct descent. A lineage assumed extinct for 5,000 years is detectable in the genes of people who are currently breathing. They don't know what they're carrying. There is no cultural memory of it, no story passed down through generations about these ancient relatives. The genome remembers something that the language has completely forgotten. There's a man, we'll call him Tsering, in his 40s, who submitted a saliva sample to a genomic ancestry project in 2022. His results came back with a category the platform had labeled Unassigned East Asian, Ancient. The platform had no population name for it, no reference group, just a signal that pointed towards something old and unidentified. He was told to contact the research team if he wanted to know more. He did. They told him the category corresponded to an extinct lineage. He asked what the lineage was called. The researchers' answer was simple. They said, "We don't know yet." That answer, "We don't know yet," is doing something important. It's not a failure. It's a description of the actual state of human knowledge about who lived on this planet before the civilizations we decided to name. The genome doesn't forget. It keeps records that no empire ever thought to burn. Now here's something that nobody in a standard history class will tell you. The Longshan culture, those extraordinary people with their paper-thin pottery and their rammed earth cities, were not conquerors. They weren't building armies. They weren't sending soldiers to subjugate neighboring populations. They were farming. They were moving where the soil cooperated. They were bringing their children. They were growing millet and expanding the only way farming communities expand, slowly, generation by generation, following the land. And in doing so, they genetically reshaped an entire continent. The genomic data from a major 2026 reconstruction of Han Chinese ancestry is unambiguous on this point. The word that researchers use is pervasive. The Longshan influence on every surrounding region was pervasive. And in genetics, that word has a specific, precise meaning. It means that when you sequence the ancient populations that preceded the Longshan expansion and then sequence the populations that came after, the earlier genetic signatures are diminished, sometimes absent entirely. Pervasive means they were replaced. Here's the part that should make you stop. The 4-chapter cultural story of ancient China, Yangshao, Longshan, Erlitou, Shang, is taught as a continuous development. One people growing more complex across thousands of years, father to son, generation to generation, an unbroken line. The genetics tell a different story, not of one people evolving, but of a series of demographic replacements, each of which kept enough of the prior culture visible that no one noticed the people underneath had changed. Chinese civilization is continuous. The Chinese people are not. These are not the same statement. And the difference between those two sentences is the entire subject of this video. At Qiaomei, a massive walled city on the Loess Plateau occupied from roughly 2300 to 1800 BCE, archaeologists found something strange embedded in the walls. Stone faces, dozens of them. Jade eyes staring outward from the outer casing of a structure that housed tens of thousands of people. The DNA of the Qiaomei population shows clear Longshan ancestry. They were the expanding culture, and those stone eyes watched over a civilization that was absorbing everyone around it and calling that absorption history. And while this was happening in northern China, something structurally identical was happening on the other side of the world. The Yamnaya pastoralists, steppe herders from what is now Ukraine and Kazakhstan, replaced 90% of Western European Neolithic farmer DNA in approximately 300 years. Same timeline, same mechanism, same archaeological invisibility during the event itself. Two hemispheres. One behavioral pattern. That parallel has never been placed inside a video about ancient China. It belongs here because it transforms what happened in the Yellow River Basin from a regional story into something that looks like a feature of human civilization itself. So far, the story looks like this. A northern farming people expanded southward, replaced earlier populations, and became the dominant genetic ancestor of the modern Han Chinese. And that's basically right. The evidence supports it. The story fits, but it doesn't quite fit at the edges. And the edges are where the real story lives. Down south, along the Yangtze River, there was a completely different civilization doing something the Yellow River farmers were not. The Longshan Culture. Not millet, rice, not rammed earth, wetlands engineering on a scale that has to be seen to be believed. They built a hydraulic infrastructure system covering 1,000 square kilometers of flooded terrain. 5 generations of coordinated labor, the largest public works project on Earth at the time, and they left behind no written language, just an aquifer and a jade tradition and 1,000,000 years of standing water management. Now here's what a new genomic study of the lower Yellow River Basin found. The northern millet farmers and the southern rice farmers were not simply competing populations. Across a 2,000-year window, they exchanged ancestry. They mixed. The northern Longshan signal and the southern Yangtze signal are both detectable in the modern Han Chinese genome. A researcher at Fudan University described the lower Yellow River as a genetic blender operating across 20 centuries. She meant it technically. And the output of that blender is the dominant ancestry on planet Earth today, carried by approximately 1.4 billion people. 1.4 billion, that number is the genomic outcome of specific mixing events that happened between 3000 and 1000 BCE. And for a moment, just a moment, the story resolves. North plus south equals Han Chinese. 2 rivers, 2 food systems, 1 genetic synthesis. It's clean, it's documented, it holds. And then something surfaces in the data that the model cannot absorb. A 2026 Y chromosome analysis, the largest ancient Y chromosome study of East Asia ever conducted, found a Western Eurasian paternal signal in ancient northern Chinese samples. A haplogroup called R. This is the dominant paternal lineage of modern Western Europe and Central Asia. It has no business appearing in the ancient Yellow River Basin at the frequency that it does. The convergence model, north plus south equals Han, does not account for it. It implies a third population, from a third direction, one that has no name in the current model, one that arrived from somewhere the story wasn't looking. 3,000 years before the Common Era, no cities, no walls, no jade workshops, just grassland, 8,000 kilometers of it, from the edge of Europe to the edge of China, a flat gray-green corridor that most maps don't think to label because it doesn't belong to any civilization's origin story. Except it belongs to all of them. Dr. Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the man whose 2015 study proved that steppe herders had replaced 90% of Western European Neolithic farmer DNA in just a few centuries, once described the Eurasian steppe as the world's largest genetic pump. He was talking about Europe. But the Y chromosome data published this year suggests the pump had an eastern outlet that no one has fully mapped. The Western haplogroup signal appearing in ancient northern Chinese samples isn't random noise. It's showing up at the exact locations where the Longshan culture was dominant, at the exact time when the Longshan expansion was reshaping the genetics of East Asia, which means that the demographic engine we've been calling the Longshan expansion, the one that produced 1.4 billion people, may itself have been seeded in part by a population moving in from the West. A population that has left no name, no mythology, no cultural artifact that anyone has correctly assigned to them. The founders of Chinese civilization were influenced by people who aren't in the story. And that is not a Chinese problem. That is a human problem, because the same story repeats everywhere we look. The Yamnaya in Europe, the Aryans moving into the Indian subcontinent, population after population, arriving from the steppe, reshaping the genetic identity of every settled civilization they encountered, and then being absorbed so completely that the civilizations that inherited their genetics forgot they had ever arrived. There is one specific genetic mutation found only in populations that moved through the Central Asian corridor between 3000 and 2000 BCE that is identifiable today in both East Asian and West Asian populations at low but measurable frequencies. Two populations separated by 5,000 kilometers, no common language, no common political identity, no shared mythology. They share one ancestor. A person who walked through a valley somewhere between China and Iran, whose name no human being has ever known. They will never meet. They will never know each other exists. But they carry the same biological memory of the same event. There's a database in Beijing, servers at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology holding genomic data from 412 ancient East Asian individuals spanning 40,000 years of human prehistory. It is one of the most comprehensive ancient DNA datasets in the world. It has a gap. Around 4,200 years ago, precisely when the Longshan Culture collapsed, precisely when the 4.2 kiloyear drought hit, the sample density in the ancient Chinese genomic record drops to near zero. For 2 to 3 centuries, the data is almost silent. Partly that's preservation. Climate disruption affects how and where people buried their dead. Partly it's excavation priority. Sites from this window haven't been dug. But it's also genetic, because the populations that appear in the record after this window are not the populations that existed before it. It's not a gap in samples only, it's a gap in people. Professor Li Liu at Stanford University has spent years doing fieldwork along the Yellow River, building the most detailed stratigraphic picture of the Longshan collapse that currently exists. She stood in front of a conference room in 2023 and told the audience that this 200-year window in the cultural record is, and these are her exact words, the most interesting thing that has ever happened, and we cannot see it. She wasn't frustrated. She was precise. The gap is not a failure of archaeology. The gap is the size of the event. What happened in those 200 years, what mechanism operated across northern China between 4,200 and 4,000 years ago, is the central question that the ancient DNA record cannot yet answer. The evidence that would resolve it hasn't been found, or it's been found and not published, or it has been. The absence is the loudest thing in this room, and that silence matters, because every civilization writes its own origin story. And origin stories begin after the gap. They begin with whoever survived. The people who were replaced before the record resumes, they have no chapter, no founding myth, no descendant king who decided they were worth remembering. The gap is not empty. The gap is full of people who didn't make it to the other side. And we are only now, with modern genomics, learning how to listen to what silence sounds like when it has a shape. Here is what 7 segments of evidence have been building toward. Not a theory, not a hypothesis, a finding, published, peer-reviewed, reproducible, that changes something fundamental about how we understand this land and the people who first stood on it. The Xingyi skeleton, 7,100 years old, Yunnan province. A human being who farmed, who had a family, who buried their dead, who had some system of understanding the world. A person fully formed, with a life, whose genome is as distant from every modern East Asian alive today as a 40,000-year-old Paleolithic hunter from the Ice Age. The people who were first on this land have no living descendants we can confirm. They left no name that survived. They built no structure that anyone has correctly attributed to them. They are not in the Han Chinese genome in any measurable way. They are not in the Tibetan genome, except as a whisper so faint that it took the most advanced genomic technology in human history to hear it. The first humans to call this land home are not remembered, not by any civilization, not by any oral tradition, not by any monument. They are present only in the data, a genomic signal in a spreadsheet on a server in Beijing, and in the faint echo carried, without knowing it, by a man named Tsiring in a highland village whose ancestry test came back with a category that had no name. I want you to think about something real for a second, right now. Whether you are East Asian, South Asian, European, African, wherever you come from, the people who were first on your land are almost certainly not the people who wrote your history. The people who wrote your history are the people who replaced them, and replacement leaves no apology in the record. It leaves only the winner's version of the story and a gap in the data where the others used to be. That is not a Chinese truth. That is a human truth. It is the mechanism by which every civilization on Earth was built. Before we reach the end of this, take a second and drop something in the comments. Tell me, where do you come from, and have you ever had your DNA tested? Because everything we've covered today, the Xingyi lineage, the unnamed Western signal, the gap in the record, it's not just Chinese history. Depending on what's in your genome, it might be yours. There are active research projects right now, running in labs in Beijing, Shanghai, and Leipzig that are trying to fill the gap, trying to find the samples from that 200-year window, trying to extract enough DNA from enough sites to answer the question of what exactly happened between 4,200 and 4,000 years ago on the central plain of China. Those projects have not yet published. The answer to the most important question in this story does not exist yet. It may be published next year. It may be published in 10 years. It may require a technology that hasn't been invented. We are watching science in real time, and the science hasn't finished. But here is what we know right now. We know that a person died in Yunnan 7,000 years ago whose people left no descendants, no name, and no monument. We know that a culture called the Longshan built something extraordinary on the Yellow River, cities, infrastructure, a demographic engine, and then collapsed into a gap in the record that no one has fully explained. We know that the populations that built what we call Chinese civilization were shaped not only by the Yellow River and the Yangtze, but by a signal from the West that the standard model has no name for. And we know that somewhere in the data, in a faint signal detectable in certain Tibetan populations, in an unassigned ancestry category on a consumer DNA platform, in a haplogroup appearing in all the wrong places, the people who came before are still there. Not loud, not traceable in any clean, satisfying way, but there. The genome does not grieve. It does not commemorate. It does not choose what to remember. It simply records. Every migration, every replacement, every catastrophe, every surviving child, all of it, compressed into sequences of 4 chemical letters, copied and recopied across 140 generations, landing eventually in the cells of people who are eating breakfast right now and have no idea they are carrying the biological record of events that happened before writing existed. You might be one of those people. Right now, somewhere in your DNA there may be a signal that no ancestry platform has a name for, a lineage that moved through a place that no current map marks as significant, a person, your ancestor, who lived through something that history never recorded and survived it just barely enough to become a number in a genome that became a number in another genome, passed forward through time like a message in a language that only machines can currently read. We opened this with a bone on a hillside and a team of scientists who didn't know what they were holding. We are closing it the same way, because the honest answer, the real answer, the one that the data actually delivers, is that we are only beginning to understand who was here before us. We are only beginning to hear what the ground has been trying to say. The first people who stood on any land we now call home were not the people who named it. They were not the people who built its monuments or wrote its histories or decided which stories were worth keeping. They were simply the first. And the first, in almost every case, were replaced by someone who had no interest in remembering them. Except the bone remembers, the bone always remembers. And now, for the first time in human history, we know how to listen.